The reason for our today's program is the circumstances that accompanied the elections that took place in the cities of Krasnoyarsk and Nizhny Novgorod. And the pre-election atmosphere in our city, the meaningless for the citizens, struggle between the representatives of the Apple Party and their competitors leads a reasoning person to the questions. Do the citizens need these election hodgepodges? How does everything that happens in the framework of election campaigns correlate to true democracy?
Everything that has been happening lately resembles a purpose-oriented campaign to discredit the election mechanism as such. Unfortunately, many thinking people have already taken this bait and are ready to defend the mechanism of direct appointments of governors in our country. In fact, this mechanism will to an even greater degree untie the hands of the bureaucratic high-handedness and the competition of financial bags for the right to put documents on the president's table. In addition, through the efforts of officials, the president himself may be set up, when future failures in governance made by pseudo-specialist appointees may be blamed on him. Therefore, you should not, having become lost in one of the labyrinths, try to go from it into a deliberate dead end. The time has come to rethink the methodology of election campaigns and begin real preparation of voters for a meaningful participation in the elections. Such a preparation, first of all, presupposes exposing the current system of using voters in the dark, bypassing their consciousness. Cynical PR specialists who rely, through money, on the tools of mass zombification of the population skillfully teach us to elect candidates without regarding their professional qualities, but as a product in a supermarket, by bright wrappers and labels, by the amount of money invested in a PR campaign of a candidate. They do this with mercenary intentions. Ostentatious, pointless for business TV shows bring unbelievably high earnings for their developers and directors. Thus, according to the available estimates, the budget for the current election campaign in the St. Petersburg Legislative Council will be about $10 to $15 million. 1/3 of this money is factually spent on the election process, the rest is reaped along the election process by the plowman political technologists and PR specialists. So the current political technologies have strong supporters. Fortunately, the majority of our population, unlike Western voters, does not accept these schemes of fooling the people, when the elections are used only as a screen to cover up the previously cooked political kitchen. Subsequently, this election spectacle enables those carrying out conceptual power to redirect the complaints towards the people themselves. What are you not happy about? After all, you yourselves made your choice. The number of those who do not vote is growing every year. The number of those who do not go to the polls is also growing. Analyzing the people around me, I am inclined to regard their non-participation in elections as a sign of stable psyche health, since they cannot be involved in the pre-election hysteria. A significant proportion of those who do not vote meaningfully did not go to the elections, regarding them as a game with unknown, constantly changing rules. This game has financial owners who solve their own tasks using, for their achievement, a thoughtless electorate and lusting after power candidates. Recently, a more prominent protest has emerged. What degree of rejection from the proposed election model does one need to have in order to stay in the city during one's own day off, come to the polling station, and vote against everyone? This is no longer a protest against any party, it is a protest against the dominant conception of governance in all political programs. And it is these voters who begin to dominate in the elections. This was the case in the 209th district of St. Petersburg, in the city of Pskov, and in other regions as well.
But what variants are there for overcoming the crisis of election campaigns? This is a very ancient instrument for expressing democracy, people's power.
The problem is that we are trying to apply an instrument that worked properly in the past in a society with a fundamentally different information state. Democratic institutions applied in relation to a certain person are good when voters have their own views on the professional and human qualities of the candidate, when they see him in his doings, in battles with him on the battlefield, as it happened before. Now society has transformed into a global information village, and the voter is not dealing with the candidate himself, but with a PR double, built on his basis, which can differ a great deal from the original. Consequently, the elections will only be interesting and accepted by the majority if we change the vector of the objectives of the election campaigns. Today, the priority is the task of organizing elections in order to obtain a certificate of democratic society and the task of financial image promotion of candidates. The election, the choice between adherents of one conception as it happens today, is meaningless. The end result does not depend on the choice, which is why thinking people do not go to elections, and if they do, they vote against everyone. If the term conceptual power is absent in the vocabulary of this or that politician, it means that he, in principle, is not able to regress from the algorithms of behavior prescribed for him by this power, just as a computer or machine with a program control is not able to productively go beyond the program. For the higher-ups of the Euro-American biblical conception of governance, the forms and methods of achieving the wanted result absolutely do not matter. What is the difference who will work out what is planned and according to what scenario they will organize the flow of raw materials to the West? According to the Marxist-Trotskyist scenario, Primakov, Zhuganov, Yavlinsky. According to the monarchical scenario, Mikhalkov. According to the bourgeois democratic one, Nemtsov, Chubais. According to Scientology, Kiriyenko. According to the national chieftain scenario of a strong hand, Zhirinovsky. So vote as much as you like. The choice of faces is wide enough.
Viktor Alexeyevich, to criticize, as they say, is always easier. What could you suggest instead of the currently developed election technologies? After all, probably you're not a supporter of the technologies of the 1970s, when the results differed from 100% by a decimal point.
There are states in the world in which the duty of citizens to go to elections is enshrined in the constitution, and non-participation entails punishment. This idea was also voiced on NTV channel in one program on October the 20th. The requirements for saving financial costs connected with repeated elections with a low turnout are tailored for the justification of this judicial norm. De facto, this is how elections were held in our country in the 1970s. This model leads the adherents of democratic ideals to self-negation of these ideals, from the struggle for common and equal for everyone suffrage to the demand for obligation to everyone to vote. And now I will talk about the main thing. How should we change the vector of objectives of election campaigns so that they become a real socially useful democratic instrument of governance? To do this, it is necessary to move from the elections of personalities to the elections between proposed by candidates' conceptions of governance, to elect between conceptions, but not between political slogans that do not even pretend to change the conception. The voter will go to the elections if they become an instrument with the help of which our people will receive clear, prognosable answers not to secondary questions, but to questions that condition the future of both the entire state and any family from ordinary people, the entire laboring majority.
But there are hundreds of such questions and screaming problems today, and each voter has his own trouble.
Anyway, nothing will change in our country until we understand that all these, as you rightly say, hundreds of problems, are an inevitable logical consequence of single root causes, hushed up by all politicians without exception. These are so-called conceptually significant problems about which it is not customary to talk in the dominant conception. Their presence is regarded as self-evident. There is a strict taboo on the discernment of conceptually significant problems by voters. As an example, I will name such a self-evident problem as usury, the lending of money at an interest rate which during perestroika ranged from an insane 230% per annum to a no less insane current 21% per annum. But in the history of mankind, there are known periods when usury was punishable by death, and Surah 2 of the Quran still considers it the most terrible sin. In our country, both internal plundering of participants in productive labor and plundering through external borrowings are accepted as the norm. It is usury that gives rise to hundreds of inevitable, natural, secondary consequences for the overwhelming majority of people. The collapse of the industry during perestroika, with the volume of production falling more than 2 times, unemployment, poverty, alcoholism from despair, broken families, street children, etc. All the mass media, the press, candidates for deputies, minors, are allowed to talk about all the consequences without exception. The main thing is not to allow minors, teachers, doctors to begin to see, so that they do not gather at the entrance of the central bank. Discerning conceptually literate candidates for power also requires a special preparation of voters. Here it would be appropriate to recall the exact recipe given by V.I. Lenin. Every cook has to learn how to govern the state. Let us warn you against a typical mistake that is made, not to govern, but to learn how to govern. This is a case where Lenin was right. The fact is that any rights, any democracy are good only when they are connected with a measure of responsibility equivalent to the volume of rights. This is what I would like to bring to the radio listeners as a priority. Any voter who is responsible for his right is simply obliged to go through a certain educational minimum concerning the conception, algorithms, and principles of state governance. They are understandable for anyone with a school education. Non-understanding of the aforementioned things is connected with the fact that it is not customary to talk about them. They are classified as secret knowledge for initiates. So the non-readiness of the voter to effectively participate in the elections cannot be blamed on him. It has to be blamed on the system, for the easily mobilizable active part of our democracy is the lumpenized population, especially drunkards who willingly sell their votes for a bottle of vodka even to the devil. It is easier to rule a drunken people, noted Catherine II in her time. This is true for the currently dominant hermetic conception of governance towards the people of our country, bypassing consciousness. The conception of social safety which I represent presupposes dehermetization of secret knowledge, open bringing to the peoples of Russia the essence of the conception and algorithms of governance.
And how do you see the scheme of preparing voters for the meaningful realization of their rights, its content?
Since we are talking about the formation of the worldview position of the entire people, this is impossible without the participation of the state system of public education, without the involvement of the mass media in this problem. This is not about the widespread imposition of this knowledge. This is about the provision of such an opportunity to those who wish. It should be noted that the course of the sufficiently general theory of governance is being taught today, albeit optional, in many universities of the country, especially in Siberia, in the Ural region, since 1997 at the St. Petersburg University. This initiative was supported by the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, after visiting the University of Tomsk City. After that, a special department was opened at the University of Izhevsk. The department headed by the chairman of the Central Council of the Conceptual Party Unity, K.P. Petrov. Today, all the numerous pan-Russian channels are contently similar to each other, like Siamese twins. At the same time, they have one thing in common. In the general broadcast you will not find even 0.1% of the time allotted for coverage of conceptually significant problems. The only task that is being solved by television today is to wean a person away from thinking. Vote with your heart, otherwise you will lose. Such is the slogan. Therefore, we need one pan-Russian channel that will prepare the voter. This channel will, in essence, be a school of governance. It will cover the conception of social safety, the priorities of supranational conceptual power, elements of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Such a channel would very quickly gain a popularity rating, especially among the thinking part of our society. Some directions of such a popular educational worldview program could be demonstrated. Ultimately, such a preparation should provide voters with a methodology for evaluating a candidate's election program. It should also help the candidate to form the vector of his own socially useful activity. Of course, this knowledge is not needed by someone who intends to get personal benefits and work off the money of sponsors. In my opinion, the thematics of all our previous 14 programs were selected precisely according to this principle, to lay the primary bricks of distinction, to form worldview understandings adequate to real practice, to remove zombifying programs. The worldview enlightenment of the voter, of course, is based on understandings of conceptual power, the picture of the real governance towards states, radically different from the officially proclaimed legislative, executive, and judicial power. This understanding, if it exists in people, will definitely find its specific reflection in the program of any level, because the country is an integral mechanism. Something in high places cannot be implemented if it is not understood and reflected in the programs of any municipality. The next litmus test of worldview consistency is the understanding and use by both the candidate and the voters of the concepts and terminology of the sufficiently general theory of governance, which is the connecting link of all systems of branch scientific knowledge, and which gives a view on the principles of the formation of the vector of objectives of governance, a view on the vector of the current state of the system of governance, on discerning the vector of error of governance. Understanding the ABC of governance presupposes discerning military weapons as the weakest instrument of impact used by those who have not comprehended the work of the more formidable priorities of aggression, for example, genetic weapons, alcohol, tobacco, drugs. It is important to form a distinction in relation to the financial credit usurious system as an instrument for enslaving countries and peoples, as well as the schemes of enslavement by the method of cultural cooperation through ideologies, religions, historical and worldview priorities. Any person entering into politics should be concerned about the interests of many. Consequently, he is simply obliged to have a view on the opposition between demographically conditioned and degradational parasitic needs of people. I would like to believe that the cycle of our programs is the first sprout of the strategy that can transfer our country to a mode of crisis-free governance. After all, we are engaged in the popularization of that global system of knowledge which is openly stated in the conception "dead water" in 35 books connected with it. A way out of the crisis is possible if every one of us learns how to govern the state, and if all of us together, meaningfully, consciously, incarnate into life the conception of social safety through election mechanisms. We will change the current puppet algorithm of governance to powerful autocracy, people's power.